Good day, folks. Welcome back to a discussion on the OpenLDAP. I'm going to walk you through the installation and configuration of OpenLDAP on a Solaris 11 operating system. I'm using Solaris 11 as my operating platform because of my familiarity level with Solaris. It should by and large work the same way on just about other operating systems where OpenLDAP is supported. OpenLDAP administration documentation has step-by-step procedure of installing and configuring OpenLDAP on just about all other operating systems. With the idea that you get from this video, you should be able to go back and install configure OpenLDAP on the operating platform of your choice. I'm sure about that. In case if you haven't got time to watch my previous video on the introduction to the OpenLDAP, I'd strongly encourage you to please go back and watch that video before you watch this demonstration so that you may want to be familiar with some of the jargons and terminologies that we use in the LDAP in general. So before you watch the demonstration, so that the demonstration is quite clear to you, I strongly encourage you to please go back and watch that introductory video on the OpenLDAP so that this specific video goes through quite smooth for you. Like I said, I'm using a Solaris 11 machine. Different operating systems have different ways of installing the packages. In Solaris 11 operating system, we install the package from a repository. For those who are familiar with Linux operating system would know there is a yum repository or a apt-get repository if you are using Ubuntu, from where you download the package. Just the same way, Solaris operating platform maintains all the packages on a server called IPS server. IPS stands for Image Packaging System. But we do not have to download the OpenLDAP package and install the package because it comes bundled as a part of the Solaris 11 installation. I can verify that. First, let us verify that I am indeed using the new release of the Solaris operating platform. As you can see, this is the fairly recent release of the Solaris 11. It's 11.2, which was assembled on 23rd June 2014. I can verify whether the package OpenLDAP is installed on this machine by running the command pkg info OpenLDAP. So if you are using Solaris 11.1 or Solaris 11.2, chances are that the OpenLDAP is already there as a part of your operating platform. But I noticed that in 11.0, which was the first release of Solaris 11 operating system that came out in November 2011, OpenLDAP was not bundled as a part of the operating platform. So we had to install the package from the IPS repository. The installation of this package is also a fairly simple process. You should use the same command, but the subcommand would be install. I can safely run this command in this situation also, even though I have the package installed, because it will come back and tell me that the OpenLDAP package does not require any update. Means to say the package is already there on the system. There is no update available for this package in the image packaging system repository. There you go. You can see the message that says no updates necessary for this package. So I repeat, the installation of the OpenLDAP is going to be slightly different in the other platforms. If you are using Linux, you might be downloading this package from the yum repository, or there is a tar.gz file available from the OpenLDAP website which you could download gunzip and untar. In case if you find it difficult to follow the instructions in the documentation of the OpenLDAP, feel free to email me at ask@fedg.com and I should be glad to offer as much of assistance as possible to get OpenLDAP up and running on your system. Or even better, you could post your message on the news forum on this fedg.com website so that I can attend to it as soon as I get to see this. Or maybe someone else who watches the news forum or subscribe to the news forum should be able to give you the required assistance to get started with the OpenLDAP. So looks like the installation part was quite simple because it is bundled as a part of the Solaris operating platform. The next important part is to configure the OpenLDAP. Now here is the most important point I would like to mention here. Just like every other service, OpenLDAP also has a configuration file. It's called as slapd.conf. The good news about the LDAP in general is that once you understand one LDAP server, like the OpenLDAP, it is fairly simple to go and understand the understand the LDAP servers that are offered by different vendors. SLAPD is going to be a term that you will come across in just about every directory server solutions that are available in the platform. Sun's directory server, for example, also has SLAPD, but it was referred to as NS-SLAPD, where NS stood for Netscape, because the directory server product was developed in a combined venture with Netscape way back in the early 2000s, before, of course, Netscape pulled out of that. So all I'm trying to say here is that there is a configuration file, a critical configuration file that is used by the LDAP server. Now, it is your duty to find out where this configuration file is. Of course, the location of this configuration file is going to vary. It depends on the operating system that you are working on. In Solaris 11, that file is located under the directory opt etc OpenLDAP slapd.conf. That's the name of the configuration file of the OpenLDAP in Solaris 11. I have to mention this again, that this need not be the case if you're working on a different operating system. So you might probably want to use a find command and under the user directory, or under the USR directory, or under the etc directory to figure out where the slapd.conf file is. But this is the most important file before you start configuring the LDAP server. I haven't even started my LDAP server. It is in a disabled state, but before I start it, I have to make sure that I have every bit of it is right in the configuration file. Of course, doing a very complex configuration is out of scope, because we are only getting to know the OpenLDAP in this session. Maybe based on the participation level for this specific session, I would probably be hosting additional programs around the OpenLDAP which could take care of the complex configuration available on the OpenLDAP. But for now, I'm going to keep the configuration to as minimal as we can. So let's open the file with our favorite editor here. One thing that you might want to observe here is that it is asking us to use a schema. You might recall from the discussion that we had on the OpenLDAP, there was an introductory discussion on the OpenLDAP. Again, if you haven't watched it, I request you to please go back and watch that video before you go through the demonstration here. Schema is what defines the rules. What are the attributes that are supported by the OpenLDAP? That's actually defined in this schema. So when I add data to my LDAP server, when I put data into my LDAP server, the data is attribute centric. There will be a number of attributes that exist in the data. Whether that attribute is valid or not is checked against this schema. I would only be able to use those attributes that are defined in the schema. Now, there are chances that you are not happy with just the core.schema. It depends on what you would eventually be using your OpenLDAP for. You might have your own schema. You might have your own attributes. For example, if you're working for an organization where there is an attribute t-shirt size, of course it's t-shirt size or a t-shirt name is not certainly a part of the standard attribute supported by an LDAP server. So you might want to define your own schema, your own rule that says, okay, I'm going to support these attributes also. I have to include that schema in this configuration file just in case if you would like to add attributes like t-shirt size or t-shirt name, etc. So I'm including the basic schema here because I do not intend to have custom attributes in the data that I would finally put into the LDAP server. What is also interesting is to note here that when I start my OpenLDAP server, there will be a PID file that is going to be generated, and that's going to be generated under var OpenLDAP. Of course, you can always change that if you would like to. What is very, very important is to come here. There are many other things in the configuration file. For example, access control list. What kind of access a user has? Can the user view the attributes of the other users? Can the user change the attributes of other users? Can the user change his or her own password? So all of these are defined by using some rules, and that's what we refer to as ACL, which stands for access control list. You might see a warning here that says, if you do not specify any ACL, if I do not configure any access control instructions or access control list, every user will be able to read and view everything. So it's not the safest of all the configuration that's available, because it's actually dangerous. But since we are discussing the default values to start with, we will go by that configuration, meaning every user would be able to operate on the data of every other user, which is the default behavior. It is a data store. LDAP server, we kept on mentioning in the previous video that it's actually a data store. There is a database, an underlying database that is being used by the OpenLDAP. That's what a BDB is. BDB stands for Berkeley DB. A very interesting name that BDB has is Sleepy Cat. In fact, it was developed in Berkeley. That is why it is referred to as BDB, Berkeley DB, which is now, of course, a part of the Oracle database. I mean, Oracle is owning the BDB now. Berkeley DB is the underlying database that is used in OpenLDAP, and many other directory servers also uses BDB as the underlying database. I understand that LDAP server from IBM, for example, uses DB2 as the database, underlying database. So you need an underlying database where you can eventually put the data. In the OpenLDAP, the underlying database is Berkeley DB, or BDB in short. You remember what a suffix is from the earlier discussion. That is the top, that is a root where you start everything. You know, directory server stores the data in a inverted hierarchical tree structure. The top level branch, I may not be able to call it a branch, the top of the root is what we refer to as a suffix. So I have to define a suffix. Of course, there is a default suffix here. I'm going to rewrite that default suffix and say I want a suffix. My root should be dc is equal to fetg comma dc is equal to com. That's what I meant by that. Also, every directory server will have a top level administrator, like you have a root user in Linux operating system or a Unix operating system who has all the capabilities, who has the capability to do anything in the operating platform. Just the same way, there is a top level administrator in a directory server also. In OpenLDAP, the top level administrator is manager. CN stands for the common name, DC stands for the domain component. So I'm going to say I want to have a user by the name manager under this branch. Since I modified that, I would specify CN is equal to manager, comma DC is equal to fetg, comma DC is equal to com. You might recall what a DN is from my previous discussion. But as you can see, what I have mentioned there is actually a DN, or distinguished name, that which uniquely identifies an entry in the directory information tree. So that's going to be my top level administrator. CN is equal to manager, comma DC is equal to fetg, comma DC is equal to com, because you have the topmost branch, or the root level of the branches is actually DC is equal to fetg, comma DC is equal to com. You also would see what is the password for that user. The default password from the configuration file looks like it's secret. I think it is okay to retain that. Of course, you have to take adequate precaution to make sure that these passwords are not leaked in your environment. None of this is a best practice of doing or configuring an OpenLDAP on your production site, since the intent of this discussion is only to familiarize all of us with OpenLDAP and some of the main operations on the OpenLDAP which can help you rocket yourself into the OpenLDAP administration. I'm just leaving it as it is without paying not much attention to the security aspect of it. I said BDB, or the Berkeley DB, is the database that is used to store the data of the OpenLDAP. Now, where is this database located? It has to be on a file system in my operating platform. The default file system where this is going to be located is var OpenLDAP-data. No prices for guessing there. You can always change this to a directory of your choice. Maybe if you are more concerned about the performance, you might want to put this on a separate storage or a high-speed disk, because it's going to be in organizations, authentication normally happens by using the LDAP server. So there might be a million of users who would contact the OpenLDAP server verifying their user ID and the password. So if you want a fast retrieval, you would probably put it on a separate file system. But for now, I will go by the default. The default location of the data is actually var OpenLDAP hyphen data. There is an instruction that is mentioned there. The directory mode has to be changed to 700 so that it is readable, writable and executable only by the owner of that directory. Now this is a very important step which sometimes we overlook, and I've had instances where we forget to do this. We forget to specify the right ownership and the right permissions, and suddenly the service goes into the maintenance mode. The LDAP server doesn't start. And sometimes it so happens that it doesn't give us appropriate information on why it failed to start. So in such situations, it's quite hard to go and figure out, sometimes such silly mistakes could consume a lot of our time. So make sure that you follow a checklist and make sure that you specify the right permission for this directory as well as the right ownership for this directory. It is certainly not recommended to start these applications as a root user. You have appropriate users for each of these applications. So let's keep this directory name in our mind, var OpenLDAP hyphen data. That's the name of the directory. So I think we have managed to make the basic changes in this configuration file. Mind you, I haven't done much in the configuration file. All I have done is I changed the name of the suffix to fedg.com, and then I also changed the name of the root DN, the top level administrator, to cn is equal to manager, dc is equal to fedg, dc is equal to com. I retained the password as it is, secret, and then we observed that the data directory of the OpenLDAP is var OpenLDAP hyphen data. We have to modify the permission of that. We have to set the right ownership of that directory. Now before I do that, let's find out what is the status of my LDAP server. We can verify that by using svcs command. Of course, this command is very specific to Solaris operating platform, or even better, you can run the command slapd ps-ef grep for slapd daemon to see if this daemon is running. Very clearly the daemon is not running. In case if you wonder why I got an output for ps-ef, that output only tells me the ps process grep command. So slapd daemon is not running at this stage. We need to start it, but before we need to start it, like I mentioned, we have to modify the permission as well as ownership of the data directory of the OpenLDAP. If I do not do that, my service is going to go into the maintenance mode. We do not have sufficient time to waste or play around with, so I'm going to go straight and change the permission. First, let's find out what is the current permission of that machine. ls-l var OpenLDAP data. Let's see what it is. OpenLDAP hyphen data. It's actually owned by a root, and it belongs to a group by the name bin. I think most of us are familiar with this command ls-l, which gives us the permission details about this file. And there is in fact one file under this directory, and the name of the file is db_config.example. This is the database configuration file. If you would like to fine tune your LDAP server, the amount of cache that you would like to assign for this LDAP server, all of this is configured in that file. Again, that's a discussion for some other day. That is not the intention here. We'll change the permission and root and bin. And of course, as you can see, this directory is only readable at this stage. So looks like, that is the default behavior. Obviously, if I attempt to start the LDAP server now, it's going to fail because it is not able to write anything. Let's go inside the directory once. OpenLDAP hyphen data, and find out what is there inside that. There is nothing much. There is an example configuration file. That's the only file that exists inside the directory. Let's see what happens when we enable the service. Would I be able to see more files under this directory or not? That is something we would understand very soon. So let's first change the ownership. We will change the ownership of this directory to OpenLDAP. I think there is a user by the name OpenLDAP, default with Solaris 11. It's not recommended to start an LDAP server or any other application for that matter as a root user. We can grep, that means I'm trying to find a string by the name OpenLDAP inside a file called etc password. This is the file you would remember has all the users in my machine. So there is a user by name OpenLDAP. I will also try to find out if there is a group by the name OpenLDAP. In fact, in Unix operating system, there is a file by the name etc group, which has a list of all the groups that exist in my system. And of course, I can see there is grep. I'm searching for a string. The name of the string is OpenLDAP, and the file that I'm searching for the string is etc group. I'm able to see that there is a user by the name OpenLDAP. There is also a group by the name OpenLDAP. So let's change the ownership. ch-on, change the ownership recursively to OpenLDAP, that's the username, colon OpenLDAP, that's the group name of what? Of this directory, var OpenLDAP slash OpenLDAP hyphen data. We can verify whether this has taken effect or not by long listing this one more time. Earlier you can verify from the output here. Now it is OpenLDAP and OpenLDAP. User is OpenLDAP, group is OpenLDAP. Earlier that was not the case. It was root and bin. So the user was root and the group was bin. Now the user is OpenLDAP, the group is OpenLDAP. So changing the ownership part is done. Next, of course, we need to change the mode. We would say 700 for this directory, var OpenLDAP, OpenLDAP hyphen data. We should be able to write to this directory. Again, if I run the ls minus l, you can see the difference there. There was no write bit enabled for this directory. Even the user, the owner of this directory, wouldn't be able to write to this directory. That's no longer the case. The owner can read, indicated by the R bit. The owner can write, indicated by the W bit. The owner can execute. Of course, execute bit is required for a directory. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to navigate inside this directory. So it looks like we have done all that is required to start the server. So let's clear the screen one more time. We'll find out what is the state of this service, SVC's LDAP server. It's in disabled state. As you can see, I'm going to enable it, SVC ADM enable LDAP slash server. Of course, in Solaris, disabling and enabling the service is done by a facility called SMF, that stands for Service Management Facility. You might be able to do this starting the server by running a script in a Linux operating platform. All you needed to be aware of was about the configuration file and the permissions for the data directory, where eventually there will be data. But before we enable, of course, I want to show you one more time that under var OpenLDAP hyphen data, there is nothing much. I mean, you only get to see one file. There aren't many other files inside this directory. I'm going to enable it now. SVC ADM enable LDAP slash server. Again, I want to repeat the statement here that starting the LDAP server, the OpenLDAP server on the other operating flavors, maybe by just running a script. And that script is mentioned in the OpenLDAP documentation, so it shouldn't be a problem to identify the script that you use to start the server. But in case if you find it confusing, in case if you find it difficult to identify the script and difficult to start the service, please ping me at ask@fedg.com. I should be glad to help you with that, or you could post that message on the news forum so that we can fix that together. So let's start it. Hopefully it runs fine. SVCS LDAP slash server. Okay, now there is something that went wrong here. It says it went into the maintenance state. We can try and identify why it went to the maintenance state by using slash var svc log network LDAP slash server. Okay, now I do not get to see much of information inside this log file. So let's verify one more time if we have set the right permission here. LDAP OpenLDAP hyphen data. So looks like that is fine. ls minus l slash var OpenLDAP. Okay, now I have another problem here. Maybe if you look at the configuration file here, etc OpenLDAP OpenLDAP.conf, sorry, it's slapd.conf. It is trying to create the PID file under var OpenLDAP directory. We modified the permission of OpenLDAP hyphen data directory, but we didn't modify the permission of var OpenLDAP. Var OpenLDAP is still owned by the root user. That might be the case. So let's verify what is the permission for OpenLDAP. So this could be the reason. So let's do one thing. Let's change the ownership. OpenLDAP :OpenLDAP for the var OpenLDAP directory and see if anything is svc as LDAP/server. It's in maintenance state. Let's say svc adm clear LDAP/server to see if it clears the disabled state there. Let's find out. It's online. So that was the case. It was trying to create a run directory for the PID file. It was attempting to create that under the var OpenLDAP directory, but var OpenLDAP was writable only by the root user. So we changed the permission from the root to the OpenLDAP, and bingo, we get it. So the LDAP server is up and running now. We can verify that by running the command ps-ef grep for slapd. This might be an easy command for you because like I said, eventually the service management facility in Solaris also will invoke a script to start the OpenLDAP. So it shouldn't be difficult in the other operating platform. You can identify what is a script, the startup script to start the OpenLDAP, and you can do that in the other operating platform as well. So it uses the etc OpenLDAP slapd.conf file, as you can see from the output of the ps-f. There is also a command called spcs-pv in Solaris 11 that you can use to identify the daemon that is started by the service. Look at the earlier output. It only gave you the state of the service, but if I use a -pv option, it also tells me what process is started by the service, in this case slapd. So we have our OpenLDAP server installed, up and running. We did the basic configuration. The LDAP server is up and running. Now importantly, we have to actually start putting some data into that LDAP server. Now there is not much of a data inside the LDAP server, but before I do so, let's go into the var OpenLDAP directory and OpenLDAP-data directory. Last time when I went inside this directory, I didn't see many files, but now that is not the case. You can see a number of files inside this, one of which of course is a configuration file. And there are some transactional logs as well. The transactions that happen on this OpenLDAP server, that is actually logged. You could use this for recovery purposes. What is also important is to know that there is a file with an extension .bdb, and this file is called id2entry.bdb. BDB stands for the Berkeley DB. This is the actual database. This is where the data is stored. Of course, you could use the Berkeley DB commands on this file, but since we are not discussing Berkeley DB here, we are discussing OpenLDAP, we are expected to use the LDAP commands to operate on this. So that's the directory, that's the database which got created. So once I run the service, once I enable the service, a directory, in fact, a database was created, and the database belongs to the Berkeley DB. So we have installed the OpenLDAP, we have changed the configuration file, did some basic configuration. We made the permissions, appropriate permissions on the data directory of the LDAP server. We started the LDAP server. LDAP server is in enabled state. SLAPD daemon is running. We verified that there are some files under the data directory, and one of the critical files is the LDAP, the database itself. We'll put some basic data into it, and then we would probably discuss about modifying the data in a separate video. So we're going to put some data into it. Let's go ahead and put some data into that. The first data I want is actually a top level, the branch called dc is equal to fetg, dc is equal to com. Let's create a file for that. I'm going to say I want to put some data. Let's find out where we are. Maybe create a directory by the name ldiff, root/ldiff. I go into root/ldiff, and I'm going to use my favorite editor there to say I want to load some data into it. Some discussion on the ldiff was done in the previous video. That was introduction to the OpenLDAP. There was some discussion on the ldiff file. We will do some discussion in the next video, and by the time you complete watching the third video, I'm hopeful that you will have a very clear picture about the ldiff file. But for now, with whatever understanding you have around ldiff, let's just have a look at the ldiff file and put that ldiff into the into the LDAP server, so that LDAP server has some data in it. I would say dn, let's say dc is equal to fetg, comma dc is equal to com. I would say object class is equal to, object class is dc component. Let's say dc object, and then you have object class organization, and then you have o as fetg, dc as fetg. So what I'm doing here is I'm adding the first entry into the LDAP server, and I have to create an LDIF file for that. The distinguished name of the first entry is dc is equal to fetg, comma dc is equal to com. That's the first entry in my directory server. The attributes that I am adding for this entry, which is O and DC, these are the two attributes. As you can see, O stands for organization, is fetg, the value is fetg, and DC, which is the domain component, the value again it has to be small f there. Yes, it is small f. Now these attributes are defined under the object classes DC object and organization respectively. So if you are using some attributes for an entry like O and DC in this example, you are expected to specify the object class that defines this attribute in the LDIF file. So all I'm doing here is I'm trying to add one entry on the top, and that one entry has a couple of attributes, which is O, fetg, and DC is fetg in small letters. These attributes are defined under the object classes DC object and organization. That's why I had to define those object classes also. I mean, we had some discussion around this in the introductory video on the LDAP. We will have a detailed discussion around this in the third video also. But for now, I hope you understood that because I'm adding some attributes for this entry like O and DC, I'm expected to define the object classes to which these attributes are going to be defined. You're going to see a lot of this coming in the subsequent videos of this topic. So obviously by the time you watch the complete set of videos, you would have a fairly decent understanding of how an LDIF file is written. So let's save this file. This file is saved as data.ldif. I'm adding just one entry. I'm taking it step by step. Let's add this entry into the LDAP server. Before I do that, let me search my LDAP server. I'm doing an LDAP search, and I would say I want to use cn is equal to manager, comma dc is equal to fetg, comma dc is equal to com. The password that I want to use is secret, and I want to search under fetg, dc is equal to fetg, comma dc is equal to com for all the object class attributes there. Again, I would be discussing the LDAP search command in detail in the subsequent video. For now, all I'm doing is I'm doing a search as indicated by the command LDAP search. What is -d? The username that I'm using to perform the search. You would remember that in the slapd.conf file there was a dn mentioned, which was the top level administrator, which is nothing but cn is equal to manager, comma dc is equal to fetg, comma dc is equal to com. And what was the password? The password is -w. I have no idea what -w stands for, but that's the password. And then I'm saying, where do I want to start the search? It's a tree structure, isn't it? On the tree structure, where exactly do I want to start a search? I want to start a search at the very top, which is dc is equal to fetg, comma dc is equal to com. What am I searching for? I'm searching for all entries that has the attributes object class. That's the easiest and the coolest way to search for entries in directory server, because every entry should have this attribute called object class. Otherwise the entries cannot exist, obviously. But let's see what happens if I search for this. Let us use the command one more time. It says no such object very clearly, because there is no such thing as dc is equal to fetg, comma dc is equal to com yet. You're going to add that. We're going to add it now by using the data.ldif. Let me show you the data.ldif one more time. What am I doing? I'm saying dc is equal to fetg, comma dc is equal to com. That's a branch. What is it? I want to add two attributes for this branch. One is O, the other one is DC. O is fetg, that is organization name is fetg, and DC is domain component name. Domain component is nothing but the name you specify here. Since these two attributes are defined under the object class as DC object and organization, I have to mention that as well. Once you do this, I run the LDAP add command. I would say I want to add, and of course, if you want to add something, you have to mention the authentication. That means I want to authenticate myself as manager, the top level administrator, specify the password. That if I don't do this, if I don't specify the password, it's going to prompt me for a password. Probably that is a preferred way, because you don't want the password to be displayed as a plain text. Someone might be watching over your shoulder to figure out what the password is, and especially for a top level administrator like manager, certainly not recommended. And then I would say my LDIF file is data.ldif. That means the entry that I want to add is actually written inside a file. So let's see what happens. It gives me a message that says added an entry, and the entry is fetch dc is equal to fetch comma dc is equal to com. Now, which means we have managed to create the very first entry in our directory server, the very top level entry in the directory server. The top level entry is dc is equal to fetch comma dc is equal to com. We can of course verify that by running the command ldap search, and let's see what happens. Last time when I tried this, I didn't get any output. It was giving me an error, such an object did not exist. But now you can see there is an object. Of course, I added this entry by using an LDIF file. More on the LDIF file as we progress through the discussion. This is just the beginning. Please do not get intimidated by the LDIF file there. All I've done here is install the OpenLDAP, did the basic configuration, changed the permissions, started the OpenLDAP, then added the very first entry, that is the top root of my inverted tree there, and that is dc is equal to fetch comma dc is equal to com. I used an LDIF file for this purpose, and it went through fine. I'm able to search for that entry in my directory server. I hope you would be able to digest what we have discussed so far. This is of course the very initial stage of our OpenLDAP discussion. We have got our OpenLDAP up and running now. I'd strongly recommend, before you watch the subsequent videos, you might want to go back to your operating platform, your favorite operating system flavor, and then get an OpenLDAP up and running. Add the first entry, which is the top root of your branches. Then we will start adding more data into that tree structure, and then we will operate on that data in the subsequent videos of this bootcamp on the OpenLDAP. So thank you for watching. I hope you would come back to the next lesson with an OpenLDAP up and running on your system.